Good day, everyone. This is co-host John Schlarbaum, here to inform you that a new companion book to the podcast is now out. Titled Music Virgin No More, I delve deeper into how my weekly charts began and why the music from the early 80s still influences the preferences of millions of listeners 45 years later. Again, the book is Music Virgin No More, a fun and easy read filled with facts about the singles, albums, and groups you still love today. Purchase your copy on Amazon for only $15, and thanks for downloading today's episode, which begins right now.
CJBK London, it's 154.
Welcome, music fans, to the Music Virgins No More podcast. Now here are your hosts, John and Jason.
Hello, and welcome to the Music Virgins No More podcast. I'm John Schlarbaum.
And I'm Jason Kavanaugh.
Now, for those new to the podcast, here's a little background about us. Jason is a former rock star, accomplished guitarist, and currently an award-winning sound engineer. While I am primarily known as the author of mystery novels and a former private investigator. But a thing we have in common is our interest in the history of music, and although there is a 20-year difference in our ages, we've remained friends now for about 20 years, which is crazy.
That is crazy. And as for the show itself, it's based on John's memories of top 40 music between 1980 and 1982, when sadly he created 106 weekly music charts, typed up on a small portable typewriter alone in his childhood bedroom between the ages of 13 and 16.
All alone. Now, each week we'll dive deep into these historic charts and discuss the music that, in part, became the soundtrack of my life.
On today's episode, we're going to recap a very special chart, number 7 for the week of October 40th, 1980.
And why is this one so special, Jason?
Well, because it debuts your new chart and my new favorite. Your top 10 albums rankings alongside the already established top 15 singles and groups of the week.
That does sound special indeed. Now, because of this addition to my other charts, I thought it would be fun to look at the top albums for the weeks you and I were born, Jason. So, in my case, it was the week of March 26, 1966. Now, I couldn't find any Canadian listings, but in the US, the top albums were number 1, The Ballad of the Green Berets by Sergeant Barry Sadler. Number 2, Whipped Cream and Other Delights by Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. And Herb was on a roll because at number 3 was Going Places by Herb Alpert. And number 4 was The Sound of Music soundtrack. And number 5 was a little band we might know called The Beatles and an album called Rubber Soul.
Hey, John.
What?
Your age is showing.
I know I am old, but at least I have a Beatles album in my top 5.
Okay, I'm scared to ask this question, but what were the top 5 in the year I was born, 1986?
All right, Jason. So you should be kind of scared. The number 1 album the week that you were born was Whitney Houston's debut. Number 2 was Promise by Sade. Number 3 was Heart's biggest sort of comeback album called Heart. Number 4 was Scarecrow by John Cougar Mellencamp. Number 5, a huge hit. Everybody remembers this one. Nobody remembers this one. Welcome to the Real World by Mr. Mister. And as a bonus, Jason, I'm going to throw in number 6 because it's one of your favorites, the Broadway album by Barbra Streisand. So, yep, every one of those was a massive rocking smash.
Well, I wouldn't laugh too hard, John, because you were both listening to and buying with your own money this music back in 1986.
Yeah, I guess touche on that one. Now, I did have the John Cougar Mellencamp and Heart Records, along with that week's number 7 album, which was Brothers in Arms by Dire Straits. But then again, hell, everybody had that one in their collection that year. And when you keep going down that week's chart, Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen was down 1 spot to number 21 after 92 weeks on the chart. As to your listening to comment, When I look back at my year-end charts for 1986, it appears I'd sort of already stopped listening to a lot of music.
Is 1986 the first year since the 80s began that your charts would have started to differ from the national or local ones, do you think?
I think even the year before, there was like a shift in my taste, or like, seriously, I just didn't like the music being played on the radio anymore. Now, for context, at the time, I was like 20 years old. I was in my third year of college, and I was working part-time in a record department of a big chain department store. So maybe I just stopped listening to new music because I didn't have as much free time and was still kind of content with the, older artists and their current releases. That said, there was something definitely off in my life because Boston's long-awaited third album called Third Stage ended up at number 22 of my top 25 rankings for the end of the year. So obviously, something was going horribly wrong in my life.
I hope we'll do a recap show of 1986 because I feel my only contribution will be asking you multiple times. John, what were you thinking?
Well, seriously, Jason, I'll try my best to acquit myself on any bad decisions, but that's going to be a very long show.
Speaking of shows, maybe we should get started on this one. Let's review what was happening the week of October 4th, 1980 in that West Lorne, Ontario bedroom of yours. Music-wise only, please.
Trust me, nothing else was going on in that bedroom aside from spinning records. And that would be for several years after that, too. But let's start with the singles charts for this week. So number 15 was My Mistake by the King Bees, down 1. Number 14, Emotional Rescue by the Rolling Stones, also down 1. Clones by Alice Cooper, guess what? Down 1. Number 12 was Drugs in My Pocket by the Monks that somehow went down 5 spots. Now, last week we discussed the song and the group at length, and I find, seriously, this kind of drop is surprising as the song had entered the chart at number 7, but it now slipped out of the top 10 for unknown reasons. But then over the next 3 weeks, it shot up to number 4. Something was going on. And at number 11, All Out of Love by Air Supply, which remained unchanged.
In fact, it was the only unchanged single that week, probably because the 5 new entries the previous week, plus the new one this week. And then from 10, we've got Play the Game by Queen, down from number 6. All Night Long, Joe Walsh, down from 5. Touch and Go, The Cars, which is debuting this week.
Woohoo!
Number 7, Late in the Evening, Paul Simon, down from 4. And 6, You Better Run, Pat Benatar, up from number 8.
Look at her go. So the new song, Touch and Go, was the first single off the Cars' third album, Panorama, was following the massive success of their debut album, the one that featured Good Times Roll, My Best Friend's Girlfriend, and Just What I Needed, which were the first 3 songs on side A, which, in fact, the whole album is really a greatest hits package. Especially if you listen to FM stations in 1978. Now, if anybody out there has never heard this album, please find it song for song. One of the greatest debut albums ever, in not even my humble opinion, a lot of people's humble opinions. Now, they followed that up in 1979 with Candy-O and continued with, the big hits Let's Go, which is my personal favorite, and It's All I Can Do. So now here we were a year later, and although Touch and Go was a moderate hit, the band had moved into sort of a heavier, aggressive, less poppy sound that threw many listeners off who didn't like the change.
Billboard magazine said that while Panorama retained the Cars' minimalist approach for their debut album, it sounded sufficiently different to avoid having the group sound like a caricature of itself. Would you agree with that statement, John?
Well, for me, their debut and Candy-O are basically cut from the same musical cloth. If you put these two albums on shuffle, you'll find all the songs very entertaining and even experimental at times. And like the review says, with Panorama, the songs aren't bad, but there is like a harsher feel to some of them. And if you randomly played a song off of it right now, I couldn't immediately tell you what album it was off, except it wasn't off the first 2. So like Billboard stated, a third similar album avoided them sounding like, they're basically, a cover band of themselves. So a third such album might have also had critics listening thinking, can they do anything else?
Hey, that never stopped Bon Jovi.
It didn't, unfortunately. Now, like everything in life, change can be both a good and a bad thing at sometimes. And for the Cars, after 2 albums, they're able to break the mold and slightly reinvent themselves, which carried them into a new musical direction that extended their career a few more years and ultimately bigger success.
And we'll see how big of a success when we see how you ranked them in your album chart soon.
We will. Now, until then, Jason, what were my top 5 singles for this week in 1980?
3 of the 5 were moving upwards from the previous week. I'm All Right by Kenny Loggins, jumping from number 10. Cocaine and Tulsa Time by Rick Clapton, down from number 2.
Every time.
Every time. Games Without Frontiers, Peter Gabriel, up 6, this week's fastest mover. And at number 2, Upside Down by Diana Ross, up 1 after 5 whole weeks on the charts. And the number 1 single for a second straight week was, John.
Another One Bites the Dust by Queen.
Rightfully so.
Honestly. Now, here's a fun fact about the song, that it was never meant to be released as a single, but one of their fans, a huge fan, persuaded them to do so. And do you know who that was, Jason? Anybody? Who would be a really big musical person in 1980?
Well, somebody that would be big enough to persuade Queen's mind would be the one and only Michael Jackson.
You are correct.
He thought it was a great dance record, breaking from their usual, rock operas and anthem kind of sound. And it was the first number 1 crossover hit at pop, soul, and disco radio stations, and it opened up a whole new market for Queen, really.
It really did.
Unfortunately, the song's success led to, the Hot Space album, which is basically a Freddie Mercury solo record featuring Queen here and there. It's experimental, it's dance, funk, it's all of those things. This departure not only infuriated longtime rock fans, but it effectively killed the band's career in North America. Does Hot Space ever appear in your 1982 charts? And what was your take on the album at the time, John?
Well, it does appear on my charts, but with Queen, personally, I went along for the ride and never had a trouble with Hot Space, the album. It was different, but still Queen, a band that I'd been following for several years at this point, and had a majority of their great 1970s records. Now, to me, The Game, which was their most current album, was like a major departure sound-wise, but was a huge hit, and obviously I really liked it. So, when the follow-up Hot Space comes out in a couple of years, it's just another eclectic set of songs to me. Not all are dance numbers, like some people will have you believe, but there is a lot more synthesizers being used and less actual drumming by Roger Taylor. And he has publicly said how much he disliked making this album. Now, as for my album chart, Hot Space entered at number 4 on May 22nd, 1982, and was number 2 for 6 weeks and in the top 3 for 10 weeks. It was also sitting at number 10 when I made my last chart in August 1982, having spent 15 weeks on my chart. So, an almost 4-month run seems, pretty good to me. So for me, I don't have a problem with The Game. I don't have a problem with Hot Space. To me, every Queen album, there was always something different. They weren't one group that had one set of songs that, sort of varied up and down like you can, hear on a lot of other, artists of the time that would bring out, oh, here's our hit, and here's a variation of our hit, and here's a variation of our hit, where the whole thing sort of sounded the same. With Queen albums, there'd be a song that sounded like it came from a record in 1940, and there would be some hard rocking song as they're inventing heavy metal. And then there would be some love song like, You're My Best Friend. Like with Queen, if you look at their output, every album, there was something a little bit different to it. So I didn't have a problem with either of these albums, both with a lot of synthesizer, which did not appear on any of their 1970s albums.
So you touched on it, but Wikipedia, if you look at their, genre listing for each album, you look at Night at the Opera from 1975 and, the one with Bohemian Rhapsody in the year of 39, it lists it as progressive rock, pop, heavy metal, hard rock, and avant-garde pop. However, when you look at Hot Space, the genres are listed as rock, disco, dance, funk rock, and rhythm and blues, and pop. And zooming out with a bit of perspective of time, like you look at the songs on Hot Space, Body Language is such a huge song even now, and Under Pressure, you can't go to Shoppers Drug Mart without hearing Under Pressure.
Unfortunately, for whatever reason, I think an Under Pressure may hit number one on my charts later on. But in the big picture, I was like, it took 5 guys to write this song. But I mean, there's a whole subcontext about why that song was, how it was made and how sort of serendipity it was. And, there's another song that David Bowie, laid down backing tracks for, but he says, yeah, I don't want my vocals on that. So again, the album itself is a very good album. If somebody just listened to it from start to finish, they would go, that's just like an entertaining album. And I think it still is. It's very much like the way when I listened to their, I think it was their 1978 album, Jazz, just completely different, but a joy to listen to from start to finish because of Freddie's vocals, because of the choruses, because of whatever. And whatever they were doing musically, it may have turned a lot of people off because they only wanted them to be like this hard rock band, news of the world, we will rock you. And to me, I guess, again, I'm 13, 14, 15 years old at the time. I'm just listening to it for the music. And if I put the needle down on the record and I enjoy what I'm hearing, that's all that matters. It really is. No, like with Hot Space, I think they got off track a bit, but in Europe, they still love them. And Queen certainly came back very strong with the album The Works in 1984. Now, if that album, Jason, had been released after the success of The Game and Another One Bites the Dust, they would have been even bigger gods of rock now than they already were. So one last thing about the album Hot Space, as I grew older and read more about Queen and record reviews, I realized it was another album I was supposed to hate, but didn't.
I feel like a lot of, I guess I'll call them legacy bands in this time period, kind of all had to reinvent themselves to keep up with the 80s. Everybody from, Fleetwood Mac going from their pop rock roots to very polished pop. You had, Elton John tried and I think failed in the early 80s, but
he kind of did.
Yeah. But, and Queen to me did it successfully.
Right.
Some of their biggest hits are in that, post The Game and The Works and all that stuff.
And they continued to put out like really good albums after like Hot Space. They had The Works in 84, which sort of reestablished them as, yeah, we're going to, make a rock album. We're going to give the people everything. That's the famous quote, right? That's how the album got its name, where, they says, yeah, we're going to give the fan, you didn't like what we did last time. So this time we're going to give you The Works, meaning we're going to give you the big Queen guitars and the big Queen choruses and big epic songs that you wanted. And then they just continued on until, unfortunately, Freddie Mercury's death. But their next, 4 or 5 albums, again, were much bigger in Europe and the UK, where their esteem went, much higher than in the, in the US. Like obviously, Live Aid played a big part of them reconnecting with the United States. But from there on, like they weren't as big as what, they were across the pond.
There you have it, folks. After our Queen Love session, that was the top 15 singles for the week ending October 4th, 1980. Not many big changes from last week.
No.
And now, before we review the debut chart for the top 10 albums, my new favorite, let's take a quick look at the group's charts. Queen, of course, remains your favorite artist. Pat Benatar made her way up to the number 2 spot, probably because of the new album cover.
That may be.
Paul McCartney and Wings dropped to number 3, and the Monks steady at number 4. After crashing their way to the top 5 was The Cars. Crashing, I see what you did there.
See, I'm a writer. I know how to do. I know how to make little tweaks.
They are this week's fastest mover, no doubt due to their new single and album.
No doubt at all.
Now, one curious thing I had about this week's top 15 group chart is the re-entry of Supertramp at number 12 from 16. Is there a quote-unquote bubbling under chart that I don't know about, John?
I wish I had the bubbling under chart, but I was, I remember at the time I had these small pieces of cardboard with the album names on them, and I'd used to keep track of my favorite groups. So, sadly, those little cardboard pieces are long gone, but I kept them at the time. So technically, there could have been maybe a top 20, although I guess I felt top 15 was enough typing each week on my little typewriter. I would sit on my bed with these little tiny pieces of cardboard with the albums or group names on them and just sort of lay them out in order. I think I may have had them on some little ring of some sort that, I could just, sort of flip through and go, oh, I like this person better than last week. And I would move them. Then I would, probably get a piece of paper and type them up from these little pieces of paper on my bed. But unfortunately, I threw those out. I wish I had those, Jason. I really do. Now, it wasn't until, so I probably did have a bubbling under chart, but, top 15 sounded good. Now, it wasn't until chart number 36 that I actually shortened the group's ranking to a top 10, and then I eliminated the listing altogether on June 13th, 1981, which was chart number 43. I just probably at the time figured the group's chart is not moving up or down. I'm not getting all these new groups switching. I have, maybe even I started in 1981, Jason, I cemented in who I liked and who I didn't like, and that was it. But I'm sure it was also, there's nothing happening here, so I will just stick with my albums and singles, and we'll continue on from there.
Okay, well, that then brings us to our next logical step in your chart's evolution, the addition of the top 10 albums list. I think now is as good a time as any to ask my favorite question.
Which is?
What were you thinking, John? Why didn't this happen sooner? Like on chart number 1.
Honestly, Jason, I don't really know. Because when you look at this week's debut albums chart, it's obvious I had most of these albums when I started at the end of August. It's not like all of a sudden I rushed out and grabbed 10 new albums and went, hey, I should make charts of these. Now, a few, when we reveal them, were fairly new, but had I started a month or two earlier, albums like In the Heat of the Night by Pat Benatar, The Pretenders' debut album, Love Stinks by Jay Giles Band, Damn the Torpedoes by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, probably But the Little Girls Understand by The Knack, and of course, one of your favorite albums, not The Wall by Pink Floyd, all would have been in the top 10 easily.
Okay, and which of those early 80 albums would have hit number 1 if you'd been keeping track?
I'm thinking The Wall, In the Heat of the Night, possibly Damn the Torpedoes, and But the Little Girls Understand. Now, you have to think, Jason, at the beginning of 1980, I was also listening to a lot of albums, that were carried over from 1979, like the Eagles, The Long Run, Cheap Tricks, Dream Police, ELO's Discovery, even your favorite, one of your favorites, Breakfast in America by Supertramp, which was released in, get this, March 1979, and it was still hanging on to the number 10 spot on CJBK's weekly music charts in March 1980, a full year later.
I can't wait until we review 1979 to August 1980 for next week's podcast. That was a pretty awesome, magical time for records.
Yep. And, the lead up to my charts was a very exciting time for like a 13-year-old who really was discovering what type of music and bands and genres that were out there and, what kind of music, that I would ultimately like.
Let's get going with the new album chart going from 10 to 5. At number 10, Christopher Cross. 9, Duke by Genesis. Against the Wind, Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band. Empty Glass, Pete Townsend. Number 6, Paris by Supertramp, which was a live album. And number 5, Glass Houses by Billy Joel.
as you can see, Jason, aside from the new, Supertramp live album, the others were, pretty big albums early in the year, not just, for me, but for everybody listening to the radio at the time.
And which one of these would have been your number one album for week 1 or 2 of your charts?
I don't know. It might have been like Christopher Cross. I was a huge fan of Ride Like the Wind and Sailing. It really is one of the best examples of soft rock. The other two that would have dominated my stereo and probably alternated between number one week by week would have been the Bob Seger and Billy Joel albums.
Of those in the bottom 6, if you could only play one album immediately after today's podcast recording, which one would it be?
Kind of a tough one. After saying such nice things about Christopher, Bob, and Billy, because, I'm on first name basis with them, I would probably have to, might shock you, I'd probably have to go with Pete Townshend's Empty Glass, with Christopher Cross next, followed by Bob Seger.
Interesting. I would probably go with Bob Seger out of those, and Billy Joel as well. Okay, so how about your top 4 pretty recent releases at this point? Panorama by The Cars, Crimes of Passion by Pat Benatar, and Bad Habits, The Monks. Great album name, and great album cover. And number 1, no surprise here, as they already held down the number 1 single and number 1 group positions.
Da-da-da, it's Queen, The Game, which was basically the number 1 album all over the world. You could not escape it.
And did anyone else ever match this feat, holding down the number 1 spots, all 3 at the same time?
Only one other artist who may not be a surprise to you, which would be Bruce Springsteen, but we'll have much, much, much more to say about Mr. Springsteen in a future episode.
I look forward to that. And now for comparison purposes for the same week, we'll start with the singles charts. London's CJBK Radio's number 1 song was Another One Bites the Dust by Queen. Canada's RPM magazine had Magic by Olivia Newton-John at number 1, while Billboard magazine's number 1 remained Diana Ross's Upside Down.
For the album charts, CJBK Radio and Billboard magazine in the States also had The Game at number 1, while Canada's RPM magazine had the Rolling Stones' Emotional Rescue just barely clinging to the top spot. So Jason, after listening to all of this week's top 15 singles, what would your top 5 songs be? And from a sound engineer standpoint, were there any musical surprises for you?
Well, since there weren't any or many new entries, actually I think there was only just one, The Cars. I'll talk about that one first. So Touch and Go, for 1980, had a pretty big drum sound. Everybody in the late 70s and early 80s was doing a very dry, tight drum sound.
Right.
Everything from, 1975's Born to Run and then Rumors following, and all the way through up till 1980, it was a very dry sound. So that was neat for me to hear, looking at it from this 1980s goggles. And there was just a big mix of genres kind of thrown into the same song. With the big drums, you had like a galloping guitar part and then some sort of reverb and tremolo soaked spaghetti western guitar licks, and then you've got bright cheesy synthesizers and then like a ripping guitar solo, and somehow all of those different ingredients work together to make the song. So that was pretty cool. So since there weren't many new singles, I'm going to talk about some of these albums.
Okay.
Duke by Genesis, coming off of Phil Collins' divorce, the band got together and they all kind of pitched their songs and then worked on some songs together. So that was pretty neat to read about while I was listening to it. And one of the band members, I can't remember, but he said, we let one Phil Collins song go that we probably shouldn't have. And that was a single called In the Air Tonight. And I could see why they regret that. Well, and speaking of drums, Phil Collins just bought the Roland CR78 drum machine, which became a huge part of his sound, and it was already a big part of other people's sounds, like, Peter Gabriel. I think Michael Jackson had started using it around this point as well. And then, the 80s happened, and everybody was using, Roland and Lindrum, and I think there were a few other, maybe Yamaha, drum machines and samplers to create their sounds, and the drum kit kind of took a back seat. And this is 1980. This is the beginning of that transition.
All these new drum machines and stuff. I mean, it's just like, synthesizers, you can keep that in. Okay. Are just about, they're about to show up as well. So, I mean, you have this very much, big, a sound of a band, before on records. And that's what I love about listening to like 60s records and 70s records, because you would hear a band playing. You could hear, the drummer is playing drums, the bassist is playing a bass, a piano solo is a piano solo. And I always love listening to that. Even like when Beatles albums, were remastered and brought out, I love listening to it because it's music. And now here comes the 80s, and now you have sort of, it's not artificial music. I mean, it is what it is. But I mean, it's such a sea change of how music is put together.
Well, and doing this podcast and listening to a lot of this stuff has given me a new appreciation for the synthesizer. I used to be a bit of a purist. If it wasn't done on an acoustic drum kit and electric guitars, it wasn't for me. So anyway, that Duke album was a bit of a surprise in how cohesive it is and how well it goes together, especially considering Phil Collins is a drummer, and here he is using a drum machine. And then the next album I want to talk about briefly is Paris, the live album.
Okay.
It wasn't a new concept doing the live album. Rolling Stones had the Rolling Stones recording truck, and they rented it out to Zeppelin and Hendrix and everybody. Everybody had a live album. But this Supertramp album is one of the few that has very few overdubs. And for those that don't know what overdubs are, they would just kind of mute the vocals from the live performance because they weren't very good, and they would mute the guitars, and they would re-record all that stuff and basically just keep the drums and the crowd cheering, and that's all that was actually live. But this Supertramp album, the only thing that was overdubbed was some of the organ parts, because you only have two hands, and he was too busy playing wine glasses and Wurlitzer pianos and saxophones and all those things. And the other thing was just some vocal parts and additional harmonies. So it is a live album, and when you listen to it, it really shows you how great of a band they were, even outside of the studio, and how little studio trickery really played into that Supertramp sound. So those are the big highlights for me, this week.
It did very well, just because I'm just looking it up now, like in the US on Billboard, it ended up at number 8. In Canada, Paris, was number 3. You also had a single from it, Dreamer, which went to number 15 on Billboard's Hot 100. So this is after Breakfast in America, which really established them as one of the biggest bands. It was sort of, they weren't really I'm not going to say they were kind of a cultish band, that only certain people knew about, but with Breakfast in America, they just exploded. So a year later, after that album's, number 1 everywhere, they bring out this album. And again, it has all the big hits from Breakfast in America, also Crisis, What Crisis, Crime of the Century, pretty much all of that album is on here, which is, I think, your favorite Supertramp album.
Yes. Well, and this album was a pretty interesting attempt to get that American audience to look back at that old catalog and buy some of those older albums to sort of drum up sales, because, the American audience had just heard that Breakfast in America album.
Right.
And, that's kind of, for me, like finding a couple old Simpsons episodes from season 3 on the cutting room floor. So that was a neat marketing move. And also, they didn't really expect Breakfast in America to take off like it did, and they weren't ready with a follow-up album. So Paris was sort of a stopgap measure to both, serve their older albums and drum up sales, but also give them some time to get back in the studio and write some songs.
For me, Breakfast in America, that was my, introduction to them as, a a lot of people. But then I went back and I'm like, oh, who are these guys? So to me, I went back to 1977's, Even in the Quietest Moments, which to me is my favorite Supertramp album. You can just, every song is completely different than what you're usually listening to, where it's, a verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, chorus, chorus. And I always found that interesting. Their music is very cinematic. And also I went back, Crime of the Century, which I like, but not as much as you do.
I mean, those three albums leading up to Breakfast in America, I mean, I could put all three on and listen to them as one cohesive piece of work because they're just incredible cover to cover.
Right. And there was an album or a video that came out of this Paris concert, and it came out in 2012. So, if you want to see it, I'm sure it's out there, and you can see clips of it everywhere on YouTube and wherever you watch your music. Is there any other albums that you were interested in this week? I know this is the first week of albums, so over the next few weeks, I don't get 10 new albums. We may interchange a few here and there over the next few weeks, but really, Billy Joel's Glass Houses is still at number 5. So,
I will talk about Against the Wind a little bit, Bob Seger. I feel like this is, the one 80s album in here that still feels like the late 70s. Right. It's still a band playing, and that sort of storyteller songwriting. So I really appreciated that, just because that's normally my preference. And also, I was talking about dry drums earlier. Those are the driest drums I have ever heard. Very dead, tight sound. Okay, now, John, what's your favorite lyric of the week? I've been waiting this whole podcast.
So, Jason, I got, because it is, the first album's chart here, I just had a question for you as just a listener. For you, what is the most songs that should be on a single album?
Ooh.
Here's your choices: 8, 10, or 12. Because most of I think all the albums that are on here are, basically probably on average about 10 songs. It's not until later when the CD is released or, Transform Music that all of a sudden people have 16 songs, or every song is 6 minutes long because they want to fill up all, 72 minutes of it. But for you as a listener, what do you think is the best number of songs per album?
I don't know if I can answer that with multiple choice. For me, I think it comes down to artistically when the songs represent a cohesive piece or like a season in an artist's career, which, I mean, we've talked about this a million times. The Beatles, you could have had these two songs on that album because they were recorded around the same time and they stick together. To me, that's more important than run time, than attention span, and all of those things. I mean, like you've got how many Bruce Springsteen catalogs of, well, I recorded these 25 songs, for the river and didn't put them on the river,
Seriously, he's an outlier. For every album that he brings out, he has 2 other ones that, are a bunch of songs that didn't quite fit his, his vision for that one album. And, the songs that were never released, they're released now as outtakes, and that, some of those songs are career songs for a bunch of other bands and artists, which is crazy, right? So, and I think like in the 70s, I think like sort of 10 songs, 5 songs, per side was what most people sort of aimed for. That was like, oh well, that's about 40 minutes worth of music, and that's all you need. Like Billy Joel is famously saying there, for most of his albums, like you're never going to get a Bruce Springsteen song, dump of 60 songs, because he goes, no, we get 10 songs. We like the 10 songs. We record the 10 songs. We'd put the 10 songs out and we'd go out on the road. Like, and that was, and that was it. I mean, good, good for him, right? But like, to me, like always like 10 to 12 songs is good. I was never a fan of the, hey, here's our new album that had, honestly, like 72 minutes or an hour's worth of music. It's like, you guys don't have an hour's worth of really good music. Why don't you guys bring this down to, a 45-minute album? And I think you and I, have either we've shared with each other or, done on our own, where you take an album that's, 72 minutes and go, what would make a really good one album here for, 45 minutes? And I think you can do that very easily with a lot of albums where, most of the albums on today's chart, there are no extras, right? Like anything here, I don't think there's really, Christopher Cross was huge in 1980, and here we are, 42 years later, 43 years later. And honestly, there hasn't been hey, it's the 40th anniversary of the Christopher Cross, and, here's 7 new songs that you've never heard before, because he didn't have them.
I'll answer the question this way. Rumors had 11 songs on it.
Okay.
It really could have only had 9, and I would have been very happy. Okay, John, and this brings us to the final topic of today. Your favorite lyric of the week. What song did you pick, and what were the lyrics?
The song I picked was Games Without Frontiers by Peter Gabriel, and I know that you're kind of surprised that the song was even included in my, in my listening, because it is such a sort of a very odd song. It's very melodic, it's very cool, and I think maybe I liked it just for that point where it was just, hey, this is something different, but it has kind of cool lyrics. So the lyrics that I have were whistling tunes, we hide in the dunes by the seaside. Whistling tunes, we're kissing baboons in the jungle. It's a knockout. If looks could kill, they probably will in Games Without Frontiers.
You promised you wouldn't sing, John. You promised you wouldn't sing.
I apologize. Okay, so that concludes our review of chart number 7 of 106 for the week ending October 4th, 1980. Now, everyone out there, be sure to like and follow our Facebook and Instagram pages, where you'll find relevant pictures, information, and of course, the actual typewritten chart to review and debate among yourselves, friends, and families.
And feel free to give us your comments about the show and leave comments about songs you loved in the early 80s. We'd love to hear from you.
Now, be sure to check out next week when we'll be discussing my musical journey before I started typing my big important thoughts down. We'll be reviewing why the first 8 months of 1980 had such an impact on every record I bought afterwards. Until then, keep rocking like there's no tomorrow, and thanks for listening.
The Music Virgins No More podcast was recorded in Amherstburg, Ontario and Lloydminster, Alberta.